But again, you know what to do if things aren't clear. I put together a relatively short deck. It's not very complicated. I've got about 20 slides. I like to set your experience in advance so you know what you're getting into. And over the next 30 to 40 minutes, I'll just share with you some observations from me working in the information technology world. I realize that some of you may not work in the same environment or may not have this, be exposed to the same methodologies. So I'll try to keep things very simple because the root concerns and the root challenges I'll be talking about are pretty much universal to any type of project that involves delivering a user experience through programming means. Non-technical, I assure you, but I may introduce a couple of terms that need explanation. So just to raise your hand and let me know and things will be good. So far, so good. Yes, I don't see that many faces, but I think we're good. Wonderful. There we go. So a bit about me. From a time point of view, I've got 30 years in software design and architecture. That means that I failed more times than many have tried. And I think that's the only credential that I have is the amount of times I've failed. I've learned a lot every time. My first contact with UX delivery has been full of surprises, but I learned. I turned around and I think I developed a keen sense for making sure users get what they need and not necessarily what they want. And if you've been in the industry, you understand the difference. And I have contributed to the evolution of UX systems for things like street parking payment application, international money transfers, internal support tools for companies like Ericsson, and quite a few manufacturing dashboards. And dashboards are just the worst, right? From a song's point of view, I'm just giving you a few quotes here that help you understand the kind of person you have at the other end of the line here. Being Boring by the Pet Shop Boys is a good reminder that life is full of surprises and quite a few are good, but we have to be ready to accept those surprises and embrace them, whether they're good or bad. Got to Get You Into My Life from Earth, Wind and Fire is actually a retake on the Beatles song. And I put that up there because we have also to remember that the original is not always the best version. I happen to like that version by Earth, Wind and Fire better than I like the Beatles one. And it's part of our daily life as well. We may have a great idea, we may have a traditional way of doing things, but there's always room for a little something extra that will make it even better. And I would even contend that in the solution delivery business today, incremental change brings more value than revolutions. That's a point we can discuss through my presentation, you'll see. Changes by David Bowie, well, that's simply because any change, any time, it looks strange in the beginning. We have to make up our mind about it. We have to assess what it means for us. And change is inherently a strange thing. And we have to get over that feeling and most often than not embrace it. Rejecting the change that part of our daily life is not necessarily a sane approach to life. And finally, well, Love Shack by the B-52s, because having a good time is always a good thing. So that, in a nutshell, is what I am. I have not told you in detail what I do for a living yet, but I'm telling you where I'm coming from and what gets me going. The talk that was promised to you is this one, and I'll try to very much respect this. I may, skate around a couple of subjects and touch on topics more than others, but essentially what I want to tell you about is how user experience and solution architecture find a place and find a good earth to grow into in the time of agile methodologies. And we have plenty of agile methodologies, and I'll just tell you a little bit about those in a moment. But if you have been involved in a project in IT in the last 10, 15 years, chances are you've heard of agile or you've heard people who have done agile and have commented on it positively or negatively. The idea of agile, I'll get to, but that is one of the very common changes or transformation that companies go towards. They say, well, this we have not been good at delivering projects, we have not been good at delivering solutions. Agile is full of good promises. Let's embrace Agile and let's do it. Uh, for better and for worse. I want to talk about design intent. I want to talk about actors and stories. And this is not a Hollywood scenario. We're talking about the actors and the stories that we find within that agile methodology. In the UX world, you talk about personas and you will talk about user journeys and paths. We are talking about the same thing with slightly different labels, but I'll try to connect the dots as we go along. And then we have a bunch of non-functional aspects of solutions. This is my bread and butter. Most of the time, what I have to care about is non-functional aspects. And from a UX point of view, you are also facing with a number of non-functional aspects to the solution that you have to promote, that you have to push through, and that you have to make relevant or part of the solution. The agile methodologies are playing against you, like they're playing against me. And I'll explain that in a minute. I will talk about systems and human behaviors, and I will finish with reaching a common vision across teams because I think that's key. It's key from an architect's point of view to create that vision, how the application is going to fulfill a mission or fulfill a vision, and it does encompass providing a great user experience. I also want to mention that when I say user here, I'm not limiting myself to consumers. Uh, all types of users, all types of personas or actors have to be part of a good solution design. And that's another point on which Jen and I connected when we met last year. It is important that we onboard people from security, from infrastructure, from support. Those people are users, they're actors, they deserve to have a great user experience as well. And no support personnel likes to be woken up in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. for a stupid little error that was not documented anywhere. And unfortunately, it is part of their user experience. So how do we onboard such users into our solution design? That is pretty much what I will be talking to you. And as I said, I got about, I think I had 24 slides, including the thank you one. And hopefully we'll get to the thank you. And if not, it's all good with me. I'm very appreciative of this opportunity to share with you my insight on these topics. So before I go too deep, and that's probably the most technical slide of the whole deck. Yes, there will be pictures, there will be more than just words. But I want to tell you that when I look at the IT industry, and this is coming from a fairly recent report, that's the industry I live in, we are still looking at only about 30% of projects that are considered success. 20% or so are considered utter failures. That's not good. And what we mean typically by success here is simply the solution being delivered in production. That's not even having a great adoption by user, and much less a return on the investment as promised by the business case. So we're still not delivering with high level of success from an IT point of view. I have to say that the same report that you have a link to here suggests that code is a liability. And I explain what that means in a second. But before I do, just one little piece of housekeeping. I've got a few links in my presentation, and I'll make sure the PDF version is available to you and that those links are working. So if you want to dig deeper into a topic or another, you'll be able to just click on those links. Okay. Now, source code, whether it's HTML or it's CSS or it's Java code or C Sharp, that code grows old. It gets patched. We lose the expertise. It may be written in a way that nobody else can read it. It's difficult to maintain or evolve, and sometimes it's even difficult to locate the source code of a given system. And that's why we will see reports like this one that suggests that the code that we write is actually a liability, it's not an asset. And that's a very interesting point of view, and one that I've started to embrace not too long ago. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have code at all. It means that we should have the least amount of it. It's like debt. Having debt is not in itself a bad thing. It's a matter of how much debt you have and how it balances out with the rest of the equation. But this idea that writing code actually creates liability should resonate with people that have experience in the IT environment. So then the report goes on suggesting that solutions that involve writing no code are actually a better approach. Well, I would think that this is not quite correct. You may end up with less liability from the code point of view, but you've created other liabilities and other exposures. For example, when you use a third-party application such as SaaS, and I hope it's an acronym you've seen before, stands for Solution as a Service. We hear of infrastructure as a service and platform as a service and solution as a service. This is just the repackaging of words like a service bureau and ASP that have been around for a very, very long time. SaaS is just the new modern approach to outsourcing the execution of your solution. Using those actually creates an exposure in that you lose control as a company over a lot of your user experience. You may be using multiple SaaS, and that could be a Salesforce on one side, and it could be a Dynamics, Microsoft Dynamics on another, and it could be some external Atlassian software for ticketing. All those tools, even though they don't require you to build any code, and project manager may see it as a good thing, you still end up with disparate, very disconnected user experiences. And you're missing out on a few of the usability criteria that Nielsen is famous for, like consistency and standards, and familiarity for the user, and matching the real world, and recollection rather than recall. All those points become very difficult to reconcile if you're using a bunch of externally sourced applications to run your company. So you're actually making quite the trade-off by saying we will use only SaaS, only external sourced application. And that has an impact on the UX experience, which you master. It also has an impact on the architecture. As an architect, I want the data to be aligned across those systems so that we can create dashboards, as I was mentioning earlier. You want terminology to be aligned across systems so we can bring data together and we can actually train some users to do more than one thing within the company. But if we're creating silos by selecting those external applications, those external UIs, those external user experiences and functions, we're creating boundaries that may end up being very negative from the company. So I will challenge very much this idea that no code is the way to go. I think we have to find the right balance here. And this idea of using code or no code does not explain the failure rate. Because ideas like service bureau, ASP, outsourcing, they've been around for a while, and we're still looking at only 30% of projects that are making it to production. So I don't see SaaS and other no-code approaches as really answers to the high failure rate. And another point that is dear to me is to consider that all projects start with a great idea. It's really in the execution that we tend to falter. It's in the execution that we lose our way. It's in the execution that we lose focus on the customer, or we make it so complex for a customer to extract the value that it stops making sense. We will not get adoption. We will not get people to embark on the journey that we want them to embark on. None of this is new. That reality of few projects coming to fruition is not a new thing. And I will go back in time for a moment to tell you actually why we have agile methodologies today and where it's coming from. I'm not saying many faces except Jen, but I see Jen is very, very focused. So that's very positive. Don't hesitate to give me a comment or a thumbs up or a smiley if what I'm saying resonates with you. So I will not describe agile methodologies at length. I think you can research it if you're interested in that or if you work in that environment. But I want to go back to why we have agile methodologies. And what you see on the right-hand side is actually the cover page of the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. And that comes from 2001. At the time, before we had Scrum and Kanban and extreme programming and lean software development, a bunch of guys, a bunch of older white guys specifically, and maybe that's part of the problem, decided to get together and come up with these observations that individuals and interaction should be valued over processes and tools, that working software is more important than comprehensive documentation, that customer collaboration is more important than contract negotiation, and that responding to change is more important than following a plan. Not saying that the second part is not important, but saying the first part is more important. So already they're saying maybe we should care more about the interaction with the user. Maybe we should care more about making sure what we deliver has got some value and is useful. Maybe we should focus on reacting positively to a change of mindset instead of rejecting it because change is bad for the predictability of the project. And the responding to change part is very, very important here because if you've dealt with customers or users, you know that people will not be able to express what they want as much as they'll be able to reject what it is they don't want. And it's part of our reality. Our ability to develop a prototype has become very critical in our industry because the prototype is used then to create a reaction from the customer so that we can know exactly what it is they want and they don't. So we have to adjust to change. And the whole idea of a prototype is to expose yourself to requests for change. If you anticipate your prototype to go into production, you're dreaming in Technicolor. I should say that because I've actually seen prototypes go to production quite a few times, never quite work as well as expected. Still, it's part of the reality. If you read between the lines of that text too, you see that the idea is to minimize waste and to minimize hurdles. Waste is very important when we realize at the end of the project that what we delivered, that user experience, that integration platform, that dashboard, that they're not needed by the customer. It happens so often that we have jokes about it in the industry. But the point is here that we can minimize that waste and we can minimize the hurdles by working in quick iterations, doing something quickly for someone, showing it to them, getting feedback, going back to the lab and improving on it. Through iterations, or what the Agile world calls sprints, we're actually increasing the value by increment, adding a little bit of value through every iteration of 2 and 3 weeks in size. What we are doing here is essentially eliminating the risk of delivering something that is irrelevant. And that is the core of Agile. The whole idea of Agile is to not deliver a solution that will be irrelevant. And the solution can be irrelevant for a number of reasons. It could be irrelevant because it doesn't meet the user's needs, because it's unusable, because the business problem is no longer present, because the cost of delivering the solution outweighs the revenue we would get from it. But the point is, out of the 3 points of the triangle that project managers care about, the scope, the timeline, and the budget, we're saying, hey, the scope, we want to really, really nail down. We want to have it perfect to a T. We deliver value and relevance. But that means we're increasing the risk that budget and timeline will not be respected. But if you look at the bigger picture, that's the sweeter risk. That is the best risk to take. If you respect the timeline and respect the budget, but deliver an irrelevant solution, you've lost all your money. If you deliver something relevant that it cost a little bit more or took a little more time, you're still getting something back from your money. So it makes sense to see the world through those eyes. But because of this, it also advocates something that sounds very scary for people that are new to Agile, and that's to deliver the simplest thing that can work. Let's not look too far into the future. Let's focus on what we need to do today and what is being asked of us today. And maybe it will be wrong, and maybe we'll have to throw it away. And this whole idea of working for the simplest thing that can work, it's a bit scary. And it actually antagonizes people that like complexity. People that like complexity try to tackle the more complex problem, and they will not or hardly see how solving the simple problem today is actually contributing to solving the larger problem tomorrow. And those people are passionate about tackling the bigger problem today. All I'm saying here, there's no right and wrong, is that the introduction of Agile within a delivery team is going to antagonize a few people. I can guarantee that. Being told that what you do today may not be useful tomorrow, we may need to throw it away because the customer changed their mind, is actually something that nobody likes to hear. It's not a fun message to hear at all. It does imply as well that whenever we get into that agile way of thinking, doing the simplest thing that can work, our ability to refactor, to change things around, becomes the most important capability, the most important competence we must have. We must be able to take something that was done one way and rearrange it, whether we're talking about a UX, a UI, an architecture, a database environment, or a network. We may have to rethink our own approach and turn on a dime, which is demanding. And it means that you have to leave your ego at the door and have a lot of confidence into your ability to deliver. And that's a hard balance to strike. So working in an agile environment is not something that is easy. And I tend to say that working in agile is for grown-ups. If you're still expecting to be a diva and if you're bringing your ego into work, working in agile is not going to be comfortable for a long time. So your self-confidence may take a while to adjust. And it's waters that can be navigated, but I'm telling you that, hey, it's got some pitfalls to it. This approach of focusing on the simplest thing that can work, it's a way to look at the steps, not at the envisioned staircase. So there may be a staircase in your head of how we're going to reach the second floor, but that staircase may be pretty different from what you anticipate. And we're being asked to focus on the shortest thing, the smallest thing, the simplest thing that can work. Sorry. I will tie that into a vision that is specific to UX and architecture in a minute, but I felt it was important to show you that, in my view, agile methodologies are essentially a risk management strategy. That's what it comes down to. We remove the risk of irrelevant solutions, but we increase the risk on timeline and budget. And that feels not so comfortable for people that are doing the project accounting or that are doing the long time planning. Okay, I want to tell you about one thing that is a problem, and I will let you absorb the image of the kitchen because I have a tester at home. When I do presentations like this, I submit those slides to my personal tester. And when I showed this slide, my tester said, well, that's not a realistic kitchen. And she really focused on the kitchen here. I don't want you to focus on the kitchen. It's a nice, colorful kitchen, but it's not a practical or realistic kitchen. But it does represent the IT group in a lot of companies where executives, and I'll try to use a highlighter here. There we go. There is a request from the enterprise to use a certain amount of the money in a certain amount of time to go in a certain direction and deliver a certain capability for the business. And that is something that is planned either on a quarterly basis or on a yearly basis. And those requests are put into an IT department to improve on something or deploy a capability or come up with a solution to a problem so that we can reach to customers of all kinds and offer them value that they're willing to pay for, so that when they use whatever has been delivered through the kitchen, we get more money than what we put in it. That's the idea. Sounds simple enough. And that's where we get that 30% or less of success. So what needs to change? Well, what needs to change is to bring, as you saw in the introduction to Agile, it is the same angle I'm covering, iterations between that kitchen or that IT group or that project delivery group and the customer to validate. Validate, is this what you want? Does this work for you? Is this really what you meant? Are we using the right words? Is this simple enough to use? Will that work in your work environment or not? I was doing a project for Ericsson developing a platform for field engineers that are installing network component in the field. And it's only halfway through doing personas and interviews that we realized that a lot of those field engineers are taking their laptop to consult the ticket when they're when they're in the field directly, and this is a low light environment. It's a dark place. It's not meant for people to live. It's just a big box with a bunch of wires in it. And when we give them a very bright interface, it actually contracts the retina and keeps them from seeing the wires when they have to really perform their task. So we had to revert to a dark theme on all the applications that were meant for the field upon that realization. So those iterations were important in that they uncovered requirements that could not have been captured by the initial ask from the company. The initial ask for the company did not take all the realities of the user into consideration. And that's where people that are specialists in UX is so important. But introducing those iterations here creates a problem if the same iterations are not synchronized and expected by the rest of the business. And that's why I put that red circle here. Very often we think about Agile as something that just affects developers or development team. It is not true. The impact of dealing with the customers and with the personas and the users in iterations is actually going to impact the way that the company recovers their investment and how that investment comes back to them. And if they're not willing to play along the risk game that I was telling you about earlier, it's going to be very difficult to build confidence. The higher ups, or what we call the hippos, right, the highest paid people, the hippos are going to look at what we deliver, see a mismatch between what they asked and what was delivered, and lose confidence, even if the project brings more than the 30% success we're talking about. That unpredictability of deliveries can be perceived as a problem if the requesters in the business are not aware and endorsing this approach of going agile. I hope this makes sense. It's a bit philosophical, and I'll get closer to the ground in a minute. But it was very, very important for me to share with you this insight that we can't have just little pockets of agile in the company. We need the bigger picture. In conclusion, for this first part, that the impact of anywhere we use agile, it impacts the internal delivery team. It challenges them in their ways. They have to adjust to a new way their work is valued. What is valued will be their ability to track change and implement change, and not necessarily to think ahead too much. It also has an impact across the whole organization, because the feedback loop and the risk management strategies are changing. There are companies, and I lived through that twice in the last year, where keeping the waterfall, the big planning, the big budgeting on a quarterly and yearly basis comes clashing with the agile delivery of the IT department. There's actually a word for that. It's called waterfall with scrum in the middle. It seldom works. And I put below a link to a very good 45-minute talk on LinkedIn about running agile at scale that describes exactly the pitfalls of trying to do something that is agile and very customer centric and very iterative in the middle of a company that expects a more waterfall approach to project delivery. So I invite you, if you're curious about this, to spend those 45 minutes. But what I want to focus on in the second part of my presentation in what all of this means to UX designers and solution architects. Opportunity one of two is figuring out where to weigh in. If you've seen a little bit of Agile, you'll get that right off the bat. If you have not, it's not that complex. In the Agile world, you will hear about actors and stories. And we want to express requirements as stories because it resonates, it's more concrete. And the template for a user story goes something like, as an actor, I want to perform an action so that I achieve a goal. And at the end of each cycle of development, the actor will actually perform the action in front of the group to show, oh, yes, this is exactly what I was expecting to get. And if it's not, then we go back and we rework it in the next sprint or next iteration, and we play the game again until we get it right. Unfortunately, we get quite a few bad stories in the mix, and I just gave you two here that I unfortunately see very often. As a user, I want to have a report of user activity so I can monitor it. The red stapler, the one on the screen, just like the one I'm holding now, is a wink to Office Space, the great movie, where the actual cover page of the report was more important than whatever you put in it. And if you want to have a good laugh, then I urge you to look at that movie, Office Space. It's not a good idea for a simple reason. Nobody wants a report. Nobody wants a report. What they really want is probably some kind of information that is presented as a report. If we give a team the mandate to deliver a report, they'll start thinking about technical stuff. They'll start talking about, a report engine, crystal reports or iReports or whatnot. And they'll start thinking about the data warehouse and they'll start thinking about security. And that report is actually not something that is usable in itself. It's not what the user wants. They want some type of information, and it is that need that should be expressed here, not the format. The report is a container of information. We need to know what the information that they want is. And a report of user activity, just to monitor it, does not tell me anything about what is relevant to that user when they look at the information. So this is unfortunately something we see often, and sometimes we'll get a few more details about what the kind of report they want and why they want to monitor it. But really, this is a bad start to a conversation, and it is an important role for UX people and architects as well, and business people to have the discussion around this, especially the so that part. The so that part at the end is really what we can get our teeth into and ask the why and the why and the why 5 times until we really get to what the user is really looking for. Another counter example, and that we see often because quite often the operations people are not involved in designing user experiences. As a user, I want to have backups so I can recover in case of system failure. Again, backups are a very boring and technical thing to have, and nobody wants to have backup. What they're really looking for is some kind of continuity, some kind of assurance that the systems will be available, some kind of assurance that no data will be lost. And that's really what a story should be focusing about. I'll make one more comment, and that's really a pet peeve of mine to the point that I wrote a text in LinkedIn called Using Story Writing, I want means nothing. Wanting here is completely irrelevant. As an actor, I perform an action should be the format, and not as an actor, I want to perform an action. We want really the action verb to be at the core of the story and not the wanting. At the end of a sprint cycle, a delivery cycle or a sprint, you don't expect the actor to actually want. You want the actor to perform the action. So I really have that on my list of pet peeves working in agile environment to have stories that say I want. Unfortunately, most agile training classes today give the I want as part of the story. Where's the UX in this? How can we inject UX relevance, UX design, UX quality into that format? Where's the architecture? How do I know how things are put together? That's what I want to tackle next. We have our domains of success. In UX world, usability is top of mind. Data architecture is top of mind. And I mean this from a visualization and a data representation point of view, not from a database architecture that's completely different. Branding is important, even for internal systems. You care about usefulness as well, but usefulness gets closer to the functional requirements, but still, you may question and challenge the usefulness of a given feature or given control on the screen. As a solution architect, I'm challenged about performance and security and availability and predictability and technology. That's not a story. There are absolutely zero stories that talk about performance or security. No stories that talk about data flow, data curation, and data life cycles. So how do we bring this into the agile world? How do we find our voice so that when we deliver something, it achieves the objectives of our domains? Well, it's good to know that stories can have an acceptance criteria as well. And that is not something we see everywhere because we jump from stories to code. And very often, because of time constraints and the team being eager to deliver something that will wow everyone, we skip the part of understanding acceptance criteria. There could be even multiple acceptance criteria attached to a user story. And very often, those acceptance criteria will take the form of given, when, then. That's a typical format. But essentially, you're injecting here more information about that that should behave. If we walk this through, we have a story that says, as a project manager, I want to score potential ideas so I can decide what to include in my product roadmap. Okay, we understand the intent of the user. We have a good idea of what they want to do. They want to score potential ideas, so they take decisions. Okay, I did that. It's great if we can then explore acceptance criteria, such as once I have added ideas and scored them using the benefit and cost scoring model, when I click the rank button, oh, we have a rank button, then ideas are sorted to the top scoring ideas at the top. If I start assessing or assigning acceptance criteria to my story, I have a voice as an architect or as a UX specialist. I stole this example from productplan.com. I'm not getting any money from them. It's just that it was a cool idea and I picked up on it. So be aware that if you are working in an agile environment and you can't find a way for you to express the need for a great UX, like I do when there's no space to express a good architecture or the value of the architecture, then using the acceptance criteria is a great way in. And working and challenging these stories will get us from a story that says, as a user, I want to have a report, to a story that could say, as an online sales manager, I visualize user activity data so I can identify brand ambassadors. And if you can get your user to say that, all of a sudden, you don't need a report anymore. It's not about the report. And if you start talking in terms of brand ambassadors, immediately you say, oh, well, you're talking social media, aren't you? You want to see who's tweeting good things about us and who's tweeting bad things about it. Is that right? And just by challenging that, you may completely change the nature, the architecture, the user experience, and the quality and the value of the story. The first one was probably done in the first 5 minutes of creating the project, but we need to take the time to properly challenge stories, and that's where we find our voice. Another example, improving on the first counter example I gave you, as a support manager, I approve the solution architecture so that we can comply to promised availability levels. Oh, okay. So there is a solution architecture, and that architecture is responsible for performance, and that performance includes availability criteria. So I don't need to talk in terms of backups or system failures. I want to talk in terms of my life, my livelihood through those availability levels. So the so that component and the acceptance criteria are really the battleground where we find our voice. A second area of work is maintaining a common vision. And that is a pitfall I've encountered many, many times where we start working at the beginning of a sprint, the beginning of a project, there's a kickoff. And at the kickoff, we say, well, here's the vision. And the vision includes this and that. And we start evolving and we start advancing things. And then by the fourth week, we realize that people did not have the same understanding of what was to be delivered. One of my favorite quotes is that the problem with communication is the illusion that it has happened. And it's very true that after a kickoff, if you take for granted that everybody got it because there were no questions, you're in big trouble. You always have to make sure that your vision is clear. As an architect, I've become acquainted with an approach that I'm sharing with you quickly today. We won't get into too many details, but I want to share with you that there is a body of knowledge in the architectural world, just like there is one in project management, the PMI. Here I'm referring to a body of knowledge called TOGAF, or the Open Group Architecture Framework. And that body of knowledge says, okay, if you're doing architecture, these are the bubbles you're talking about. You're talking about vision, business architecture, information systems, technology architecture, and so forth. And the further you evolve through your project, the more refined those should be. And there is a cycle here because you have to iterate over that. And all of this becomes essentially your set of requirements. When I work into Agile, there is no repository of requirements, the stories. So essentially, what this becomes is my list of acceptance criterias here, and the so that clause of very many a story. That's my approach to it. But this breakdown of saying, okay, we got motivation elements that are important for the company. We have business layers where we see processes and high level objectives. We have applications, we have technology, and we have, once we have a working solution, to implement and migrate and evolve it before new strategies and motivation ask us to go through that cycle again. The colors here are important to what I'm sharing with you because what TOGAF has given me and that I like to use to create the common vision is a visual language. And that visual language uses the same colors that you were seeing on the previous slide with additional icons in corners to indicate the type of concept we're talking about. Here we're telling the story of an insurance company that wants to achieve higher profitability, and they've determined that they can do that by increasing their revenues. So they're not talking about reducing costs, they want to increase their revenues. And it is an objective. And you see that little target there. They want to do that by having higher customer retention. So they probably have identified that they're losing customers. And they want to increase market shares, probably not present in all the markets they want to be. And from there, they have selected course of actions, competitive premium settings, improve customer satisfaction. And this is supported by initiatives from the digital customer intimacy strategy. Wonderful. As I start going down this path, I can start relating various actors, various components, various objects and applications we have in the field, and other types of users that we have, and connecting those into our resources, our capabilities, and our objective. I'm giving you a 5 minute overview of something that takes, I would say, probably a good hour to get a grasp of. And you have the full vocabulary at the top here. I think I have to stop. Oh, okay, here we go. The full vocabulary is here, and that's the visual language to express all of this. But I've been fairly successful at using that vocabulary to bring everyone again around the same understanding of what it is we're trying to do, why we're trying to do it, and what are the teams involved, and where do we need a strong user experience. So it is semi-technical, it is a formal way of expressing ideas, and it's got meanings in the arrows as well as in the symbols. But I've gone back to this type of presentation very often as a means of bringing everyone around a common understanding. It has to evolve, but many projects that start with that kind of view will increase their velocity. They will increase their alignment to the initial vision, because we can always go back to that view on things and understand how we are driving that profitability. And let's not be shy, profitability is what companies are in the business of doing. I put a link to the visual language called Archimate at the bottom. So if you are interested in this, again, you will be able to get to it. I'm sharing it with you as a user experience team because it is, for one, very visual, which is a lot of what you do. And I know it's not limited to visual, believe me, I get that. But at the same time, it does provide an all encompassing view of what a team is trying to do and why it's trying to do things. So you can even say that there's part of that so that and that acceptance criteria that is boiled into that view of the world. And of course, well, because I'm a good technical resource, there's a third opportunity of two, and it is about recognizing a couple of icebergs. And this is very tongue in cheek, and I hope you don't take it too seriously, but here it is. I borrowed three icebergs to put in my ocean. One is about the organizational change. The top of the iceberg above the water is that vision and that strategy and those shared values and the way we say we get things done. But as UX people, like I do as an architect, we hit walls when we meet tradition, when we meet unwritten rules, when we meet feelings, when we meet perceptions, and you have to work through those in order to eventually get the value that the company is looking for. Another iceberg that is very common is to turn data into information. And believe me, that's one of my biggest concern when I'm asked for a dashboard is figuring out, okay, where's the data? How is it aligned? Is it aligned? Is it quality data? Is it recent data? Is it accurate? Is it meaningful? Does it mean what you think it means? When I was in the banking industry, I was in the messaging, interbank messaging sector for international treasury. And an outbound message and an inbound message is always relative to which part of the system you're talking about. Very often we would have conversations that would completely derail because the two parties involved were thinking that the inbound was the other guy and the outbound was me. And no, inbound means from me to you. No, inbound means from you to me. And that gets crazy. And just getting the vocabulary down takes a while. The same reflects into the data structure. You have data structures and log files and traces that are very often not aligned with what they are supposed to represent. A third iceberg I want to simply tell you about is the misdirected requirement. SSO or single sign-on is something that gets very often asked out of the UX team or the UI team because SSO is essentially a user experience. But the reality is that SSO is basically a technical, architectural, security-driven capability. To achieve SSO requires a bunch of technical things that are sometimes very complex. And to get there, ultimately simplifies the user experience, but it's not the UX people that can deliver SSO. But again, we see very often stories that describe a user experience where single sign-on. Well, that's a UI thing, so UI will take care of it. It is simply not the case. I want to finally recap everything I've told you in the last 50 minutes or so. Final words, question mark, simply because I have a tendency to talk a lot and always have something to add. So I would like you to internalize that Agile is a risk management approach. And what it does as a risk management approach is eliminate the risk of irrelevant solution. That's what it wants to do. But it does require the business to accept and manage the risk of being on budget and on time. It becomes secondary. UX design solution architecture are never the topics of agile stories. So we have to use the so that clause and the acceptance criteria as ways to, bring our quality to the mix. And finally, we need to make sure that all the actors or personas and their journeys are covered. Yes, of course, all the business users, but also people from operations. And when we talk about DevOps, all we're talking about is having the operational people part of the conversation and having their roles be part of the set of personas. That's all there is to it. Same thing for security and governance. It's all about having those security and governance people be the actor in some stories that relate to them. You simply need to bring the right people around the table in an agile framework, and you will get into those DevOps and SecDevOps mentality very quickly. And our intent as designers is to create lasting but malleable value. Remember that simplest thing that can work. We may have to shift things around. We may have to rethink some hypotheses that end up being invalid. It's just a liability that design. To me, the same way code can become a design, I don't think design can become a liability. Sorry, I don't think design itself is ever a liability, and that really is a big asset. User experience and solution architecture have that in common, that we create lasting value if we do it right, and it's never a liability. That said, 15 minutes later, I want to invite you to questions and feedback. Before I do, that's my question mark after the last words. If you like those little characters, this is from a PowerPoint file that was shared on LinkedIn not just a couple of days ago. And if you want those characters that are wearing masks or not, the link to that is earlier in my presentation. The first time I used them, they're very cool. I love that. I love that tribe. So at this time, I would open your microphones. Jen, anybody, if you have comments or questions to what I presented or anything you want to discuss, I'm all yours.
Yeah, so I guess my one question from a designer perspective, working with developers, do you ever find that like designers are hesitant to ask for things that they think are too complex, like the SSO I'm thinking of? And then like, I guess, what is the best way to probably navigate that? I mean, like, is it just ask or?
Well, ultimately, yes. But I think the prerequisite is there is trust. Uh, if you don't trust the team that's around you, you will not ask the questions. It's the same in the classroom. You know, everybody shuts up in the classroom, and the larger the classroom, the more silence there is in it. But we need to break those barriers, and we need to establish trust. I'm hoping I'm doing a little bit of this today. It's said often that solutions architects are actually mingling with UX specialists, but we have to open that dialogue for sure. The best way to go forward about it, Dan, is, as I said earlier, to leave your ego at the door. Have a strong sense that you can bring value, and you simply have to ask those simple questions, and you'll be opening cans of worms. Cans of worms, I think, is the English expression, right? In French, we open a can of crab, but in English, it's a can of worms. Uh, there's no simple answer to this except wanting to find solutions. You need to ask those questions about SSO. What does it mean? Is it really my problem? I don't think it's really my problem. Let's talk it over.
Yeah, we deal with that too, and a lot of times it's either we come back with data or research behind it, and we back up what we're asking for with that research or that data that can prove that it's valuable to the business or to the profit margin or any of that. And then it's also, yeah, building that relationship with those developers of, how can this also help make their lives easier too? If we look at it right now, we are dealing with that, and sometimes there isn't an easy answer to get around an SSO. And you have to look at other means, like maybe an API or something that you can bring in to kind of go around it without dealing with it. So bring in information that you don't have to go through an SSO.
Right. So you've been through that, Jen.
Yeah.
I'm sure, and it's difficult to redirect the requirement. SSO is not on the UX team to deliver. They can design the experience, but that's the 5% of the effort. It's very simple. As a user, I switch from one system to another without being prompted for credentials. That's all there is to it. The underlying technical part can be quite complex to put in place, but that's not for you to deliver. And it's important that you have partners that you can talk to and say, hey, they asked me to do that, but really it's not my domain. So tell me, was I somewhat relevant? Did that resonate a little bit with you people? Did I mention actual things that you're facing? Are you working in agile world today? Is that something you look at?
Well, speaking for myself, I'm new to the UX UI world. I'm currently in a boot camp. I find it extremely fascinating, but I also in a corporate environment for a very large corporation, and I've experienced some of that to some level, and I can understand some of that challenges can happen, especially influencing to leadership why things should be done for a certain way, especially when you have to spend EPMO money at the end of the year, trying to get that out. And I can see the challenges happening to that. Absolutely. I think it was really, really insightful. I'm just kind of curious if I want to get a copy of the deck, would that be possible?
Oh, absolutely. I'll send it to Jen, and Jen can spread it around. Does that work for you, Jen?
Yeah, that's perfect. We'll put it in our Slack channel.
Awesome.
You guys can ask or access it there.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Wonderful. Any other comments or questions? Again, those little guys, I love them. I love that library of little characters. It's a lot of fun.
I love the architecture pieces that you had showed me,
Uh-huh.
all how those work together and everything. Because as a UXer of one for many years, we would have to do research, we would have to do architecture, we would have to do design, we would have to create all the documents for development, etc. And we're very, because we had to do all those things, it was very, very basic or very high level. And I can say, even myself, I wouldn't use the correct symbols sometimes. So learning more of the deep dive into what each thing means, and then the little symbols within those items and everything, was really fascinating to me, and kind of empowered me a little to know more that I was doing something the right way versus the wrong way. So I really enjoyed
Thank you.
learning that from you.
Thank you. I went over that fairly quickly, that vocabulary here, but it's not that difficult, and a lot of it is just common sense. Um, if you're curious, just look for Archimate on the web. You'll find plenty of documentation. And actually, when I do those diagrams, hold on, I've got the wrong slide here. Here we go. This can, you could do that in PowerPoint and in Visio, but there's actually a free tool that knows all those symbols already, and all the connectors already. So it's very easy to put together. The learning curve is not that big because all those words are common sense, most of them. Anything about implementation, anything about technology, anything about strategy, anything about business, motivation, applications. It's semi-technical, but if you want to limit yourself to interactions between systems, you can do that. It can be very, very high level without going into too much detail. So, and you'll find the link again in the presentation that I'll share with you.
Any more questions?
I just want to make a comment, which I thought was really cool too. I know in the beginning, there was mentioning why code could be a liability. I can experience that to some fashion. Like I said, I used to work for another large e-commerce retail company in Salt Lake City. I don't want to call it out here, but the code was built from 1991, and even there, with all the millions of pages that had to be updated over time, that was a occurring issue. They came up with a backbone code that couldn't support the new code. So I could correlate that. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, another term that is used in development cycle, when we have to do a short-term fix where we know there would be a better long-term solution, they talk about tracking the technical debt. So they use the word debt as something we should have done and did not, and that reflects this on this idea that code ultimately is probably a liability. Um, it loses value. Not only does it lose value over time, but it represents more and more cost if you want to keep running it, if you want to keep improving it. So there's you need to think hard about developing a homegrown solution. The same way you have to think hard about completely outsourcing everything. And that's the job of architects and enterprise architects really is to muddle through those waters and to figure out what's best for a given customer or a given enterprise. So Jen, I will share that with you. It's been a great activity for me to be here with you tonight. It's night for me in Montreal. It's past 9:00 p.m. or it's about 9:00 p.m. Yeah, it's been a great opportunity. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I will share the material, and then I hope we can maybe eventually review this experience and maintain the channel open.
Yeah.
So I thank everyone for your time today. It's been great.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you so much for presenting. That was really wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Martin.
Bye.
Bye, Michel. Bye, Sébastien.
Thank
Yes, bye.
you.
Thank you.